The city streets were quiet, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights as an elderly woman, Martha, walked home from the grocery store. She wasn't in a rush, she never was. Life had taught her patience, and she enjoyed the simple pleasure of taking her time. With her small cloth bag tucked under her arm, she strolled past the familiar neighborhood, her mind wandering to memories of her late husband and the son she was so proud of. Ryan, a Navy SEAL currently on leave, visiting her for a few days. She had just spoken to him on the phone. He had offered to pick her up, but she insisted on walking. "I'm not that fragile," she had chuckled. Martha had no idea that just a few blocks away, trouble was brewing. A young biker, rough around the edges, sped through the empty streets. His name was Jake, and patience was not a virtue he possessed. His frustration simmered from a bad day. Too many problems, not enough solutions. Bills piled up and tempers flared. He was looking for an outlet, someone to take it out on. He revved his engine as he spotted Martha walking alone, an easy target. She heard the roar of the motorcycle before she saw him. The sound sent a small shiver down her spine, but she brushed it off. It wasn't unusual to hear bikes at this hour. But as she turned the corner, the noise grew louder, closer, until suddenly, brakes screeched. Martha barely had time to react before Jake swerved in front of her, blocking her path. Her heart pounded as she gripped her bag tighter. "Excuse me, young man," she said, trying to step around him. Jake smirked. "Hey lady, why don't you hand that over? Might be something valuable in there." His voice was laced with arrogance, his stance casual but his eyes sharp. Martha's breath hitched. "There's nothing here for you," she said firmly. She wasn't easily intimidated, but something about his gaze unsettled her. Jake scoffed. "Come on, don't make this hard." Before she could respond, he reached for the bag. Martha instinctively pulled back, but he was faster. A sudden yank, a sharp gasp. Her frail body lost balance, and she stumbled backward, hitting the pavement hard. Pain shot through her arm as she landed, and for the first time, real fear gripped her. Jake didn't care. He laughed, checking the contents of the bag. "Seriously? Groceries?" He tossed it aside, unimpressed. "What a waste of my time." What he didn't know was that time was about to run out, for him. Just down the street, Ryan had stepped out onto the front porch of his childhood home, expecting to see his mother coming around the corner any minute now. But instead, he heard something else, something that sent a chill through his trained instincts. The unmistakable sound of a struggle. His body reacted before his mind could. Years of training kicked in as he sprinted toward the noise. His pulse steady but his jaw clenched tight. As he turned the corner, his eyes locked onto a sight that made his blood boil. His mother on the ground, clutching her arm in pain. And standing over her, a stranger with a smirk that was about to disappear. Jake had no idea that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Ryan's steps were quick but calculated. His mind had already assessed the situation before his emotions could take over. He knew better than to let anger cloud his judgment. But seeing his mother, his sweet, kind-hearted mother, on the ground with pain in her eyes sent something burning through his chest. His hands clenched into fists. Jake, still oblivious to the storm heading his way, let out an annoyed sigh as he kicked the grocery bag aside. "What a waste of time," he muttered. He turned away, ready to hop back on his bike, but something made him pause. Feeling a shift in the air. Then he heard the footsteps. Steady, measured, unhurried, yet carrying an unspoken warning. Jake turned his head just as Ryan stepped into the dim glow of the streetlight. Two locked eyes. Jake smirked at first, assuming it was just some random guy passing by. But then he noticed the way Ryan was looking at him, like a predator sizing up its prey. And something about that look made Jake's stomach tighten. Martha gasped when she saw her son. "Ryan!" Her voice trembled, half in relief, half in worry. She knew him well. She knew the way he carried himself. Calm, quiet, but dangerous when pushed. And right now, she could see it in his stance, in the way his shoulders squared, in the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly. Ryan ignored Jake for a second and knelt beside his mother. His voice was low, controlled. "Are you okay?" Martha winced but nodded. "I'm fine, just a little shaken." Her arm ached, but she waved it off. "It's nothing." Ryan gently touched her shoulder, scanning her face for any signs of serious injury. He knew she was downplaying it. That's who she was. Always strong, always refusing to be a burden. But the fact that she was sitting on the pavement, instead of standing tall like she usually did, told him enough. Jake let out a dry chuckle, trying to mask the unease creeping up his spine. "Oh great. Here comes the hero act." He rolled his eyes. "Look man, I don't know what you think you're about to do, but just walk away. No harm done." Ryan's gaze slowly lifted to meet his. His eyes were unreadable, steady as stone. But his silence spoke louder than words. Jake shifted on his feet. "What? You wanna fight over a bag of groceries?" He gestured lazily at Martha. "She's fine. Let it go." Ryan exhaled slowly, standing to his full height. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to prove himself with words. Actions always spoke louder. And right now, his entire body language was sending a message that even someone like Jake could understand. Jake took a step back. Just a small one. He barely noticed himself doing it, but Ryan did. The instinctive retreat. The subtle shift of weight, as if his own body knew he was in the presence of something. Someone he shouldn't mess with. But Jake wasn't the kind to back down easily. He straightened his shoulders, forcing out a laugh. "You think you're tough, huh?" He looked Ryan up and down, noticing his athletic build, the sharpness in his eyes. He looked like someone who had seen things, done things. Ryan didn't respond. He just tilted his head slightly, studying Jake like he was a puzzle that didn't quite fit. And that silence. It was deafening. Martha, sensing the growing tension, slowly pushed herself up with Ryan's help. "Ryan," she murmured, her grip tightening on his arm. "Let's just go home." Ryan didn't take his eyes off Jake. He didn't trust him. Not yet. People like him, reckless, arrogant, quick to pick on the weak, didn't just walk away unless they had no other choice. And right now, Jake was trying to decide if he had a choice. Jake scoffed, but it wasn't as confident as before. "Whatever. Not worth my time." He turned, walking toward his bike. But as he swung his leg over, he hesitated. His pride was getting in the way. The way Ryan looked at him, like he wasn't even a threat, made his blood boil. He had spent his life proving himself, making sure people didn't walk all over him. He wasn't about to let some random guy make him feel small. So, instead of leaving, Jake did something stupid. He revved his engine loudly, then looked back over his shoulder. "You better watch your back," he sneered. "People like you, acting all high and mighty, you're not untouchable." Ryan's expression didn't change. But his voice, low and calm, carried a weight that made the night feel colder. "People like me." He took a step closer. "You have no idea who I am." And that was the truth. Jake had no idea. He had no clue that he had just threatened a man who had spent years surviving in the most dangerous places on Earth. A man who had faced enemies far deadlier than some street punk on a bike. A man who had been trained to handle situations just like this, with precision, control, and the kind of quiet strength that only came from experience. Jake didn't respond. He could feel something in Ryan's tone, something unshakable. And for the first time that night he felt something else too. A flicker of regret. But it was too late for that now. With one last rev of his bike, Jake sped off into the night, the sound of his engine fading into the distance. Martha exhaled, finally allowing herself to breathe. "Ryan," she said softly. "I know that look." Ryan turned to her, his expression easing just a little. "What look?" "The one that says this isn't over." He didn't deny it. Because deep down he knew she was right. Something about Jake's words, his attitude, it didn't sit right with him. He had dealt with people like that before. They didn't just walk away. They always came back. And Ryan would be ready when he did. That night, Ryan sat in the living room, his thoughts circling back to the encounter like a predator stalking its prey. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floor. His mother had gone to bed after insisting she was fine, but he had noticed the way she rubbed her arm when she thought he wasn't looking. It wasn't just the physical pain that bothered him, it was the fear she had felt, the moment of helplessness. And that didn't sit right with him. Ryan had seen danger before. He had been in situations where a second of hesitation meant life or death. He had encountered men like Jake before, reckless, desperate, and trying too hard to prove something to the world. The problem was, desperation made people unpredictable. And that was the part that worried him. Jake might have ridden off into the night, but Ryan knew his type. A bruised ego could be more dangerous than a clenched fist. And the way Jake had looked at him before leaving, the way his words had carried a thinly veiled threat, it wasn't over. Not yet. Somewhere across town, Jake was nursing his own frustration. He sat slouched at the back of a rundown gas station, a cigarette dangling between his fingers as he replayed the scene in his head. He had been in plenty of fights before, plenty of scrapes that left him with scars and stories to tell. But something about tonight had felt different. He had been in control until he wasn't. Until that guy, whoever he was, showed up and shifted the entire balance of power with nothing more than a stare. Jake exhaled, watching the smoke swirl into the night air. Who even was that guy? He muttered to himself. His friend, a wiry guy named Danny, scoffed. Does it matter? He's just some dude, man. Forget it. Jake clenched his jaw. That was the problem. He couldn't forget it. Something about the way the guy moved, the way he stood there without a hint of fear, made Jake's instincts scream at him. He didn't like feeling small, and tonight, that's exactly what he had felt. Insignificant. And that wasn't something he could let slide. You should have seen the way he looked at me, Jake muttered, shaking his head. Like I was nothing. Danny raised an eyebrow. And what? You gonna go back and prove a point? Jake didn't answer right away. His fingers drummed against his knee as he stared at the ground, lost in thought. Maybe he would. Maybe he needed to remind that guy, whoever he was, that people like Jake weren't meant to be ignored. The next day, Martha moved a little slower than usual, but she refused to complain. Ryan had insisted on making breakfast, and she could tell he was watching her carefully, analyzing every move she made. She had always admired how protective he was, how deeply he cared, but she also knew the kind of life he had lived. The military had trained him to anticipate threats, to sense trouble before it arrived. And she could see it in his eyes. He still wasn't convinced that last night was over. Ryan, she said gently, placing a hand on his arm as he set down a cup of tea in front of her. I don't want you to worry about this. Ryan didn't respond right away. He just pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I can't just ignore it, Mom. Martha sighed. I know. But I also know you. And I don't want you getting caught up in something that isn't worth your time. Ryan exhaled, rubbing his temple. It's not about that. It's about making sure you're safe. I don't trust him. She gave him a small smile. You don't trust a lot of people. And for good reason. His voice was firm but calm. You saw the way he acted. Guys like that don't let things go. Martha hated that he was probably right. She had seen it too. The way Jake had sneered, the way his body language had shifted when he realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. And she had a sinking feeling that Ryan was right. It wasn't over. Later that afternoon, Ryan decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. He wasn't paranoid, but he was always prepared. Old habits died hard. He made his way toward the spot where the encounter had happened, scanning the street, the alleyways, the parked cars. He wasn't looking for trouble, but if trouble was looking for him, he wanted to be ready. He didn't have to wait long. A few blocks away, leaning against his motorcycle with a cigarette hanging from his lips, Jake watched. He had been hoping, almost daring Ryan to show up. And now here he was. Danny nudged him. "Well, there's your guy." Jake took a slow drag before flicking the cigarette to the ground. "Yeah. There he is." Danny frowned. "You really want to do this?" "Look, man, last night." Jake cut him off. "Last night didn't go the way it should have." His eyes narrowed. "But today's different." Ryan kept walking, unfazed, but he had already noticed them. He didn't change his pace, didn't break his stride, but he was fully aware that Jake was watching him, testing him. Jake pushed off his bike and stepped forward. "Hey," he called out. Ryan stopped, tilting his head slightly. He didn't respond, just waited. Jake smirked, stuffing his hands in his jacket pockets. "You act real calm for a guy who almost got in a fight last night." Ryan met his gaze without a hint of emotion. "I don't fight unless I have to." Jake chuckled. "That's so." He took another step closer. "See, I was thinking, maybe we got off on the wrong foot." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you were thinking?" Jake's smirk deepened, but there was something off about it. Forced. Like he was trying to mask his frustration. "Yeah. Thought maybe we should clear the air." Ryan knew better. This wasn't about clearing the air. This was about control. Jake wanted to feel like he had the upper hand again. And Ryan wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. "I don't have anything to say to you," Ryan said simply. Jake's smirk faltered for just a second before he forced it back. "Come on, man. You don't want to talk." His tone was light, but his eyes held something sharper. "Or are you just scared?" Ryan almost laughed. Not out of amusement, but because it was so predictable. The challenge, the bait, he had seen it 100 times before. And he never took it. "I don't waste time on people looking for trouble," Ryan said evenly. "So if that's what you're here for, you can move along." Jake's jaw tightened, and for a split second, Ryan saw the flicker of something behind his eyes. Frustration. Bruised ego. Danny, sensing the shift, grabbed Jake's arm. "Come on, man. Let it go." Jake didn't move at first. His fists clenched at his sides, his mind racing. He wanted to do something, anything, to prove he wasn't weak. But there was something about Ryan, something unsettling. Finally, he forced himself to take a step back. "Yeah, whatever." He turned, swinging a leg over his bike. "See you around." Ryan didn't respond. He just stood there, watching as Jake and Danny sped off. But he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The sun had just started to set, casting long shadows over the quiet neighborhood. Ryan stood at the front window. His arms crossed over his chest, watching the street. Something didn't feel right. It had been 2 days since his last run-in with Jake, and the silence that followed was more unsettling than any confrontation. He knew guys like Jake, impulsive, reckless, and unable to let things go. And that was the problem. If Jake was staying quiet, it wasn't because he had moved on. It was because he was planning something. Martha sat on the couch, pretending to focus on her book, but Ryan knew she was just as aware of the tension lingering in the air. She had tried to convince him to let it go, but even she knew it wasn't that simple. Ryan's instincts had never failed him before, and they were screaming at him now. Across town, in a dimly lit garage behind an old auto shop, Jake paced back and forth, the veins in his arms pulsing with frustration. "I can't let this guy think he's better than me," he muttered under his breath. Danny sat on an overturned crate, arms resting on his knees. "Man, you're taking this way too personally. Just let it go." Jake shot him a glare. "No, you don't get it. Can't just walk away from this. That guy humiliated me." Danny sighed. "What's your plan then? You gonna keep following him around, waiting for him to look at you funny?" Jake clenched his jaw. "No. This time I'm making the first move." Danny frowned. "What does that mean?" Jake didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the garage. His mind already made up. That night, the air was still, thick with an uneasy quiet. Ryan had just stepped outside, locking up the front door after checking on his mother. His muscles were tense, his senses heightened. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Then he heard it. The low rumble of an engine, slow and deliberate. Ryan turned his head just as a motorcycle crept down the street. The headlights were dimmed, but he recognized the bike immediately.
Hey.
Ryan didn't move. He stood still, waiting.
Watching.
The bike rolled to a stop just a few houses away, and Jake swung his leg over, stepping onto the pavement. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there staring. Ryan exhaled slowly. If you're looking for trouble, you're wasting your time. Jake let out a short laugh. Nah, not this time. His voice was eerily calm. I just wanted to talk. Ryan narrowed his eyes. Talk about what? Jake took a slow step forward. I did some asking around. Turns out you're not just some regular guy, are you? He tilted his head. You're military, aren't you? Ryan didn't respond. He didn't need to. Jake smirked. Yeah, I thought so. He took another step closer. That explains the way you carry yourself. The way you look at people. Like you've seen things. His voice lowered slightly. Done things. Ryan remained silent, but every muscle in his body was ready. He had been in enough situations like this to know when someone was testing the waters, trying to see how far they could push. Jake's smirk faded, his expression turning colder. I don't like being disrespected, he said quietly. And I don't like people who think they're untouchable. Ryan's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Then maybe you should stop picking fights you can't win. Jake's jaw tightened. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Anger, frustration, maybe even doubt. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. I guess we'll see about that, he muttered, stepping back toward his bike. See you around. Ryan watched as Jake revved the engine and sped off into the night. But he knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Ryan stood in the quiet street long after Jake had disappeared into the night. The tension in his shoulders refused to ease. He had faced threats before, ones far deadlier than a reckless biker with something to prove. But this wasn't about him. This was about his mother. And that made it personal. Back inside the house, Martha was in the kitchen, pretending to be occupied with the dishes. She had seen the way Ryan stood at the door, how his body remained tense even after he came inside. She knew that look. She had seen it before, years ago when he came home from deployments. His mind still stuck in places he never spoke about. You're not going to let this go, are you? She finally said, keeping her voice soft. Ryan exhaled. He's not going to let it go. Martha set down the dish towel and turned to face him. What are you going to do? Ryan hesitated before answering. I don't know yet. But I'm not going to wait for him to decide when this is over. Martha sighed, worry clouding her eyes. Just promise me whatever happens, you won't let him pull you into something you'll regret. Ryan met her gaze. I won't start anything, he assured her. But if he does, I'll finish it. Across town, Jake sat on the edge of his bed, tapping his fingers against his knee. His apartment was small, cluttered with clothes and beer cans, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing. He had thought confronting Ryan tonight would give him a sense of control, but instead, it left him feeling more unbalanced. He didn't just want to scare the guy, he wanted to win. Danny's voice broke through his thoughts. Man, you're really gonna drag this out? He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. What's the point? Jake's fingers clenched into a fist. The point is, I don't lose. Danny shook his head. You don't even know what you're fighting for anymore. This started over an old lady and a stupid wallet. And now what? You're trying to prove you're tougher than some guy who doesn't even care. Jake's jaw tightened. He does care. I saw it in his eyes tonight. His voice dropped lower. He's waiting for me to make a move. Danny exhaled. And what, you think you're gonna catch him off guard? You don't even know who you're messing with. Jake stood up, grabbing his jacket. I don't care who he is. He's not untouchable. The next morning, Ryan stepped out to grab coffee from the small cafe down the street. The air was crisp, the neighborhood quiet. But the moment he stepped outside, his senses went on high alert. It was subtle, barely noticeable to anyone else, but he knew when he was being watched. His eyes flicked to a parked car across the street. Tinted windows, engine running. Ryan pretended not to notice, walking toward the cafe as if nothing was wrong. He pushed open the door, greeted the barista with a nod, and ordered his usual. But even as he waited, his mind was working, piecing things together. If Jake was watching him, that meant he was planning something. And if he was planning something, it meant Ryan needed to be ready. When he stepped back outside, the car was gone. That night, the real storm arrived. Martha had already gone to bed, and Ryan was in the living room, scrolling through his phone when he heard it, the unmistakable roar of multiple motorcycles approaching. He was up in an instant, moving to the window. Headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the front of the house. 3, maybe 4 bikes, engines rumbling low, circling the street like wolves testing the edge of a campfire. Ryan exhaled slowly. He had been expecting this. Then, a sound that made his blood run cold. Martha's bedroom window rattling. Ryan moved fast. Too fast to think. By the time he reached the hallway, he caught a glimpse of a shadow outside the window. Figure. Hey. Ryan didn't hesitate. He yanked the front door open and stepped onto the porch. You really want to do this? Jake turned, a smirk spreading across his face. But this time it wasn't just him. 2 of his buddies flanked him, one of them gripping something in his hand, a crowbar. Ryan's jaw tightened. He could feel it now. The shift, the moment when things stopped being a petty grudge and became something real. Something dangerous. Jake took a slow step forward. I told you, man. I don't lose. Ryan's pulse stayed steady, his mind calculating every possible move. He wasn't afraid, but he knew one thing for sure. This was about to get ugly. The night air was thick with tension. The low rumble of motorcycles idling in the street sent a deep vibration through the pavement, an unspoken warning of what was about to happen. Ryan stood on the porch, his body still but his mind racing. His years of training had prepared him for situations like this, when the air felt electric, when every second stretched longer than it should. Jake took another step forward, his smirk fading. He wasn't just here to intimidate anymore. He had already made his decision. His friends flanked him, one gripping a crowbar, the other cracking his knuckles like he was just waiting for a signal. Ryan's eyes flicked to the crowbar for just a second, just long enough to note the grip, the stance, the hesitation in the guy's posture. He wasn't a fighter. But Jake's hands were steady, his shoulders squared. He was ready for this, or at least he thought he was. Ryan exhaled, forcing his muscles to stay loose. You've had your fun, he said, voice calm but firm. Now walk away. Jake's grin returned, but there was no humor in it. You don't get to tell me what to do. A sudden movement, too fast for a normal eye to track. Jake lunged, his fist swinging for Ryan's jaw. But Ryan had already shifted his weight, stepping just enough to the side for the punch to miss. Jake stumbled forward off balance. Before he could recover, Ryan grabbed his arm, twisted, and with a sharp pivot, sent Jake sprawling onto the ground. It happened in seconds. Too fast for his friends to react. Jake groaned, rolling onto his back, shock flashing across his face. He hadn't expected that. The guy with the crowbar hesitated. His grip faltered. The other one shifted nervously. Ryan took a slow step forward, keeping his voice low. You don't want this fight. For a brief moment it looked like they might listen. The doubt in their eyes was clear. But then Jake, still on the ground, let out a frustrated growl. What are you waiting for? Get him. The one with the crowbar moved first, lifting it above his head. But before he could swing, Ryan was already there. He grabbed the guy's wrist, twisted hard, and forced him to drop the weapon with a clatter. A quick strike to the chest sent him stumbling backward, gasping for breath. The third guy barely had time to react before Ryan spun, sweeping his legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard, groaning. And then, just like that, it was over. Jake was still sitting on the pavement, breathing hard. His hands clenched into fists. His friends were on the ground, too stunned to move. The street was silent except for the distant hum of crickets and the fading echo of their failed attack. Ryan looked down at Jake. His expression unreadable. "This is your last chance," he said quietly. "Walk away. Because next time I won't be this patient." Jake's breath came in short, angry bursts. His pride had taken more of a beating than his body. But deep down he knew. He had lost. With a shaky exhale, he forced himself to his feet, his hands still trembling. He shot Ryan one last glare before turning to his bike. His friends followed, limping back toward their motorcycles without another word. Ryan watched as the engines roared to life and the bikes sped off into the night. The street fell silent again, the tension fading like a storm that had finally passed. Just as Ryan turned back toward the house, he heard a soft voice behind him. "Ryan!" His mother stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with worry. He gave her a small, reassuring nod. "It's over." She studied him for a long moment before stepping forward and wrapping her arms around him. He didn't say anything. He just let her hold him, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. But as he stood there, a thought crept into his mind. Jake had backed down tonight. But men like him didn't forget. And Ryan had a feeling this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. The street was quiet again, the night settling back into its usual stillness. Ryan held his mother for a moment longer, feeling the tension slowly drain from her body. He could hear her heartbeat against his chest, steady but quick, as if the fear from earlier still lingered. Martha finally pulled back, searching his face. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Ryan nodded. "Yeah, I'm fine." She exhaled, but the worry didn't leave her eyes. "I was scared," she admitted. I thought they were going to hurt you." Ryan gave her a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I knew what I was doing." Martha studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "That's what worries me," she whispered. Ryan didn't say anything. He understood what she meant. He had spent years training for moments like this, but she had spent those same years worrying about him. Tonight had only reminded her of that fear. He glanced back at the street where the taillights of the motorcycles had long since disappeared. A part of him wanted to believe that this was over, that Jake would accept his loss and move on. But deep down Ryan knew better. Men like Jake didn't let go that easily. Still, for now, the immediate threat had passed. And that was enough. Inside the house, Martha insisted on making tea, her way of bringing some normalcy back into the night. Ryan sat at the kitchen table, watching as she moved through the familiar motions, boiling water, pulling out cups, adding sugar even though she always said she was trying to cut back. It was a small thing, but it made the world feel normal again, even if just for a moment. As she set a cup in front of him, she finally broke the silence. "What happens now?" Ryan exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Now we go on like usual. I'll keep an eye out, but I don't think he'll try anything again. Not for a while at least." Martha frowned. "And if he does?" Ryan's voice was firm. "Then I'll handle it." She didn't like that answer, but she didn't argue. Instead, she sipped her tea, her fingers wrapped tightly around the mug. The next few days passed without incident. The streets were quiet, and there were no signs of Jake or his crew. Ryan kept his routine the same. Morning runs, coffee at the cafe, watching over his mother like usual. But he remained on alert. He knew better than to let his guard down. Then, on the third day, something unexpected happened. Ryan was leaving the grocery store, a bag in each hand, when he spotted someone waiting near his truck. At first, he tensed, but as he got closer, he realized it wasn't Jake. It was Danny. Ryan slowed his pace, watching him carefully. Danny looked different tonight. Less cocky, more hesitant. He shifted on his feet, hands in his pockets, avoiding eye contact. Ryan stopped a few feet away. Something you need. Danny exhaled, finally looking up. I wanted to talk. Ryan studied him for a moment before nodding. All right, talk. Danny hesitated, then rubbed the back of his neck. Look, I know what happened the other night. And I know Jake's not gonna let this go. Ryan's jaw tightened. And, Danny sighed. And I'm out. That caught Ryan off guard. Danny let out a short, humorless laugh. I've been running with Jake for years, but I'm not stupid. I saw what you did. You could have hurt us way worse, but you didn't. Jake's too angry to see it, but I do. Ryan didn't respond right away. He just watched Danny, trying to decide if he was telling the truth. Danny shook his head. I don't want any part of this. I just thought you should know. Ryan finally spoke. So why are you telling me? Danny met his gaze. Because I know Jake. He's not done. He'll come back eventually. I just wanted to give you a heads up. Ryan nodded slowly. Appreciate it. Danny hesitated again before stepping back. For what it's worth. Think you were right. Some fights aren't worth it. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Ryan watched him go, his mind turning over what he had just heard. He didn't trust Danny completely, but he believed him about one thing. Jake wasn't done. Still, for now, Ryan could only wait. He had been trained for patience, for calculated action. He wouldn't strike first, but if Jake ever came back, Ryan would be ready. That night, he sat with his mother on the porch, the air cool and still. She rocked gently in her chair, sipping her tea, while Ryan leaned against the railing, watching the stars. Martha glanced at him. You're thinking too much again. Ryan smirked. You always say that. She smiled softly. Because it's always true. For a moment, there was only silence between them, the comfortable kind. Then Martha spoke again. Do you think he'll come back? Ryan didn't answer right away. He let the question settle in the air before finally replying. Maybe. Martha sighed. Then what? Ryan looked at her. His expression calm but certain. Then I'll be here. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying away the last traces of tension. For now things were peaceful. And for now that was enough.